Steven Kramer is a public policy fellow with the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. He's also a professor of national security studies with the Eisenhower School at the National Defense University. Steven, welcome to Now. Thanks for joining us. I want to talk to you, of course, about the French elections. We've had a little less than a week to sort through the results. When you've had a chance to look at the numbers and look at the map, what are the things that jump out at you? Any surprises?
Well, there have been surprises all the way through. I mean, nothing that happened was anticipated. You know, a year ago, we all thought Alain Juppé would be president of France. A few months ago, we thought that François Fillon would be president of France.
France had other ideas.
Fate, vicissitudes, who knows? Macron did a great job in planning his candidacy. If he hadn't been incredibly lucky, he wouldn't have been elected.
Now, we have a tendency when we look at these elections in the U.S. and elsewhere as making grandiose statements about huge political shifts that often don't hold. You know, a new permanent progressive majority after Barack Obama was elected. The same thing was said by George W. Bush, a new conservative majority. Can we take anything long-term away from this French election, say for the future of their traditional political parties, for example?
Well, one thing we can say is that Marine Le Pen got over almost 35% of the vote. The National Front has gone from 1% 30 years ago to 35%. That's really incredibly important. I mean, an extremist party of the right that is based on kind of old fascist tradition, collaboration tradition, has gotten 35% of the vote. And that means that if Macron doesn't succeed, they're going to be there. That's really important.
So people shouldn't be prematurely celebrating that nationalism has failed.
We can celebrate that it didn't succeed this time, that she got less than 40%. In some ways, she shot herself in the foot. She was at about 40%. There was a debate between the two of them. And she had spent years trying to make the National Front look like a respectable party. In that debate, she really acted like a gutter snipe. A lot of, accusations, personal accusations against Macron, lies. She looked about as unpresidential as you could. And she really lost, probably 5% of the vote. That's where she went from 40 to 35.
So that might explain why the polls were off by about 10 points.
The polls had been absolutely right in the first ballot. And I'm convinced that the debate brought back memories, one of the roots of the National Front, and destroyed her credibility as a person who really could be president of France.
Do you think that performance was strategic? She was the underdog and felt she had to come out swinging, or is it more just that's who she is as a candidate?
It's a really incredible question. I've wondered about it. In some ways, it's as if the real person who she is came out. And secondly, what was also quite interesting was that she had no ability to enunciate policy. Even on issues where she had been talking for years, like the euro, she couldn't, formulate a minute or two of clear policy. But that's really great. It helped Macron, but 35% of the vote, that's huge. The other thing that happened is that the two major parties are in a state of near collapse. The Socialist Party, which is after over 100 years old, had won the presidency twice. It's split 3 parts at least. Who knows what they're going to do when the parliamentary elections take place? And Les Républicains been badly damaged. So we don't know where that's going to go.
What can you tell us about the almost a quarter of voters who abstained? What does that tell us?
Well, that's a very, very important point. You have people who abstained and 10% who cast a blank ballot. That meant that they went to the polls and wanted to make a clear point. There's no mistaking that. Well, it's a result of the rise of a extreme left that was displayed by Mélenchon's candidacy, which went from 5% to almost 20%. There were times before the second ballot when I wondered whether Mélenchon could come in second, whether it could have been a Mélenchon-Le Pen race. he did very, very well. And his people and he himself, he had certainly, some of his people, don't think there's much of a difference between Le Pen and Macron, who's a candidate of capitalism. And that's a kind of left that we found before in history. It's the people who said, well, there wasn't much difference between Hitler, and the Social Democrats in the 1930s. It's a very dangerous idea, in my opinion. It's a kind of childish view. I mean,
well, you see that in American politics, right? Those who say that both Barack Obama and Mitt Romney were corporatists candidates, and no difference.
Well,
is that a similar? I'm just trying to get it from a U.S. perspective. Is that a similar?
But 25% of American voters didn't go out and.
Right.
I mean, there's always some truth in the fact that they represent the status quo, but Le Pen isn't the status quo. Le Pen is a revenge against the system coming from a very, very dangerous tradition, the tradition of Vichy collaboration. And you know what that meant. That was a government that worked with the Germans during the war and sent 100,000 Jews to the gas chambers. Mm-hmm. It's not just the same thing, not the same thing at all. But time passes on, people forget about that. The number of people who actually, history is forgotten.
Do they forget, or did the older voters in France who favored Macron essentially remember?
They remembered, but a lot of younger people felt it didn't mean anything to them.
Now, a relative novice is, in terms of age, the youngest French president ever and the youngest French ruler since Napoleon. What are Macron's prospects, given this very complicated scenario that you just laid out for us? What do you think about his ability to succeed in this environment?
Well, there's politics and there's policy. On the politics dimension, he's been elected president of France, but you can't govern without a parliamentary majority. And how do you get that? There are elections in June. He's decided that he's going to have his own party. Not that easy to create a party out of nothing. And he's running, 477 candidates so far named. These are people who basically pledged allegiance to him, have broken with if they ever belonged to a previous party. Can he get a majority with a new party? It's not clear. If he doesn't get a majority, will he be able to work with whatever is left of the old parties? It's not clear. The danger Macron faces, it seems to me, is that he might well be thinking that he's really a political genius because he pulled off this. Maybe he's not taking into account how incredibly lucky he was. He may think he doesn't have to work with the old party leaders. In the case of the former Prime Minister, Emmanuel Macron, has basically humiliated him. If he gets his majority, great. If he doesn't, there'll be some payback from the old parties.
Well, if Le Pen had won, we might have been talking about Frexit, or the French version of Brexit. But with Macron's win, EU steady as she goes?
Well, let's say unsteady as she goes.
Unsteady as she goes is a better way to phrase it.
The point is, why did Le Pen get 35 and almost 40% of the vote? Because things are not good in France. Because the economy is bad, because there's been high unemployment for a very long time, because all those things, deficits, because the EU isn't working very well. No one can say the EU is a success, because it can't defend its borders. I mean, because you have a whole bunch of countries that are still in economic depression practically. So in order for Macron to succeed, he has to do obviously two things. One, he has to begin a process of reform. It has to be successful. He has to convince the French that they can do something to deal with the gap between the rich and the poor, between the winners and losers of globalization. It's a big task. Yeah. Very few people have come up with a coherent way of dealing with this. And secondly, he has to initiate a process of reform in the EU. That's not easy because France can't do it alone. And at the moment, the real key player is Germany. And the Germans have complained for a long time how difficult it is, when France doesn't pull its weight, when the Franco-German relationship isn't strong. And I'm sure their idea would be, it'd be wonderful to have a France that shared its ideas. But if any French government, is strong and effective, it won't share the ideas of Germany in many respects. And the Germans certainly are willing to cooperate with the French so long as, they can get their own way because they think they're right.
We agree with you if we can get what we want.
They still think austerity is a great idea. I don't think it is. And if Macron is going to be successful in France, he's also going to have to do things to change the way the EU operates. And that's going to be very, very difficult.
A lot of heavy lifts for this young man.
Yeah.
If it's unsteady as she goes in regards to the EU, what about NATO, the NATO alliance? This is good news for the NATO alliance compared to a candidate who wanted to chum up to Vladimir Putin and Russia.
Yeah, I think that it's a long time since France was the bad boy of NATO. France is, if every country were like France, that had a real defense establishment, that had a real military, that actually could do occasionally something in the world like expedition to Mali, we'd be very, very lucky. The French are not a big problem. Of course, they occasionally have their own ideas, but a big country should. So there's no big problem coming with France about NATO. Let's say the French may be more worried about American policy than we should be worried about French policy. France, Macron is one of the two people in the race who was very critical of Russia. He and Emmanuel were the two. The others were very pro-Putin. So I think he reflects a realistic view of European relations with Russia.
Final thought before we close, and I'm sure we'll be able to come back together and speak again after the parliamentary elections, but between now and then, what are you looking to? Are there any markers on how Macron is doing or what choices he might make between now and then that would indicate more about him and the direction he plans to take?
Well, first of all, he becomes president in a few days. He has to name a government. Now, this seems a little bit strange because the elections for parliament aren't for a month, but there has to be a government. So he has to name a prime minister and a whole cabinet. That's going to be pretty important. It's going to indicate where he wants to go in terms of policy, how he wants to deal with the existing parties. And we'll find out the names of all the candidates he's naming, and we'll find out a little bit more about how he plans to relate to the old parties.
Are there favorites for a prime minister? Has he mentioned anyone?
There are two people he's seriously considering. We don't know who they are. Macron has been amazingly secretive. He apparently makes a lot of decisions all by himself. And so I haven't seen names. He's been really, no, but we'll find out very soon.
Well, we'll look forward to it. And Stephen, thank you very much for helping
My
us
pleasure.
dig through all these
My
details.
pleasure.